In 1885, in the town of New Ulm, Minnesota, they erected a statue which you won't read about in any history books. Eventually, it was replaced by what still stands to this day, the Herman Monument. This statue commemorates the German victory over the Romans at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, a symbol of the German patriotism. It features the statue of Arminius, which in German means Herman, an ancient Cheruscan. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing some of these. The story is about the statue which existed before the Herman Monument. It was simply called the Viking, a statue of a raiding Viking who has a sword in his right hand, and in his left is a spear which he has with the point aimed at the sky and the other end safely on the ground. The Viking is holding the spear with his right hand out away from his body like he is proclaiming something important. The face of the Viking is in a grimace with a fierce stare that everyone who looks into the eyes say it appears to be so very real and also very intimidating. The statue had not been up for a week when the trouble started. Chuck, a German shepherd about 6 years old that belonged to Harvey Kemp, was found early in the morning on Monday pierced through the chest with the spear which the Viking was holding. It had obviously taken quite an effort to slaughter the poor animal and then get its nearly 90-pound body lifted up high enough to then impale the poor creature upon that spear, which stood about 6.5 feet from the ground to the top of its spear tip. It was a gruesome sight which set the entire town on its side. All anyone could talk about was who could be responsible for killing the Kemp dog. Fear swept through the town because Chuck was no small animal, and everyone agreed that considering the way the animal died, that it must have put up a fight before finally succumbing to its death. Common decency demanded the statue be completely washed, clean of the dog's blood, which had splattered everywhere, giving the impression that the poor animal had indeed been speared and then impaled to die in such a horrible manner. Anybody with half a brain could have told you that there was no way that dog was alive when it was slid down onto the spear. The extraordinary amount of blood which had spilled had surely been a result of after the dog passing away. By 2:30 that afternoon, the entire awful circumstance had been cleaned up and the things were completely back to their normal activities. Springtime in Minnesota can often still provide chilly nights, and there is still more dark than light, though that is certain to change in a short time. Early spring still holds on to the chill in the nights. The night after Chuck had been killed, there was an extreme cold that went through the town. People went to their homes and they huddled around their fireplaces to stay warm. Nobody went out, and the streets were completely empty, with perhaps the exception of a tomcat hunting for female company. Twice in the late hours, almost as the sun was ready to come up, the town was assaulted in such a manner as to result in the sound of two cats giving a loud scream which was then quickly muffled into silent submission. It was likely nobody ever turned over in bed when they heard the sound of the two town's cats were brutally attacked and resulting in their deaths, but not before the town was woke up to the gruesome sight of both cats having been speared, impaled, and left to wriggle in a futile attempt to free their pierced bodies from the horrible means by which they were trapped and left to die. The Viking stood defiant with the sword in its left hand and the spear holding the impaled felines in its right. It was a great mystery why the cats were not screaming in pain from their circumstance, but then later, after their autopsies, the town veterinarian reported that their ability to create any sounds had been removed with the knowledge of a surgeon, though the actual cutting had not been so professional. Apparently, whatever had wanted the animals to be impaled upon the spear did not want the attention that a screaming cat would attract. Naturally, the town was now beside itself. What kind of monster was living in New Ulm? Clearly, a message was being sent. What was it saying? The town of New Ulm hates pets? That didn't seem to be a worthwhile endeavor. The second animal killing in as many days attracted the attention of Colonel Joseph Bobleader, the founder and editor of the New Ulm Weekly Review. When the third killing in as many days drew the attention, it was of little reason why. The third morning, the good citizens of New Ulm woke to another animal skewed on the spear of the Viking. The animal had been killed outright when impaled, but it had not finished fighting. The statue, everything within the immediate surroundings of it, sunk to high heavens from the glands of a dead skunk, which, much like all the previous animals, had to be removed from its impalement. Folks around town began to refer to the Viking as the Viking the Impaler. There was a major effort to get the worst of the skunk washed away. That night, Colonel Joseph Bobleader hired a man who just went by the name of Catfish, a former slave who had been escaped the horrors of the South via the help of the Underground Railroad, to keep an eye on the statue. Whoever was behind all these horrible animal killings might try to go for a fourth night in a row. If they did, it would be their undoing, because Catfish would be there to then report what he had seen to the colonel, who, you can rest assured, would then be leading an entire mob of angry citizens to collect whoever the scumbag was that was behind the horrible killing. That night, early in the evening, the colonel had spent his dinner bragging to those who would listen how he had a plan to catch the evil killer, how it was as they were speaking at that very minute being deployed upon the unsuspecting evildoer. Yes, sir, folks, you can rest assured if the evil tries to act again a fourth night in a row, that their deeds would not go unseen. The city of New Ulm will get justice if the evil did not stop. Eventually, the evening wore down. The colonel had more than enough to drink and excused himself to go home for a good night's sleep while knowing he had a man on the job. The next morning, the city of New Ulm woke to the worst nightmare the city had ever experienced. This was a city which had considered itself to be cutting edge. A modern Gotham, which had not only had the finest in culture endeavors, but that was also a city which had a modern approach to living as any city in the entire country, including New York and Philadelphia. It was quite an ugly entry into the city's history when it was noted that on that day, a man named Catfish, a free man who had made a great sacrifice to achieve that status, had given his life in an attempt to keep the streets of New Ulm safe for all of its citizens. His lifeless body was found impaled upon the spear held by the Viking in its left hand, the right hand holding its sword. The colonel was beside himself. He had never dreamed things would escalate to such ugliness. Catfish must have seen who was behind the animal killings, and perhaps he had approached the killer, which had led to the horrific results which the city woke to find. There was, of course, a gathering around the statue while men worked feverishly to remove Catfish's body from the impalement on the statue's spear. The entire time the colonel stood around watching, trying to decide what the town should do next. This had to stop. Whoever was behind this would be caught and brought to justice. The colonel announced to the little crowd that had gathered that he was offering a $200 reward for the information which would lead to the capture and conviction of whatever scumbag was behind all this ugliness. Further, he wanted that horrible person to know that the city of New Ulm would not bow down to intimidation. The statue would remain where it was at, and that a pedestal was being ordered for it could stand even higher than currently. Stick that in your pipe and smoke it, were the colonel's last words on the subject before he began to organize a team of men, 2 at a time, to watch the statue. If the killer was brazen enough to try and do anything further, they would be for certain caught and quickly brought to justice. Nothing happened that night. In fact, nothing happened until the watch was called off several weeks later. The next night, there was nobody watching the statue. In the morning, a black lab named Midnight, who belonged to the Smith family, was found impaled upon the Viking spear. The article in the New Ulm Review read, "Local family dog found impaled on the right hand of the Viking." Mr. Smith later that day climbed up on the statue and, using a lead pipe, slid it down over the top of the spear, and then he used his weight to bend the spear so now the end of it pointed down toward the ground. Mr. Smith was heard declaring, "Let them find a way to stick a body on that." The next day the spear was again pointing up toward the sky. At least there were no bodies impaled upon it. However, the sword was stained red with blood. There were no bodies, however. The article in the New Ulm Review noted that the Viking had possibly struck again, though there were no signs of any dead bodies, be they human or animal. The article noted that the spear held in the left hand had been bent back so it was again pointing upwards, and that the right hand, the sword, was stained with blood. It would be a day or two before they knew whether it was human. The next morning the statue again had claimed a victim. Impaled upon the spear was the body of a wolverine. This perhaps was more unsettling than even the body of the free man, because wolverines were well known to be one of the most respected, feared, and fierce animals in the area. Further was the animal had died from being impaled. Whatever man had killed the animal was no coward and no weakling. It was a very large wolverine. The one thing the town sheriff had been able to note about the incident was that the animal had been alive until shortly before the sun rose that morning, which meant it was either captured and kept alive until it was killed, or that it was hunted down in the darkness of the night, basically meaning the wolverine was hunted and killed on its own terms during its own killing time, and it was killed face to face using nothing more than a spear, similar to the one the Viking held. Now, before I go on, I'm wondering how many of you have spotted the one clue which ended up concluding the case of the Viking, or Viking the Impaler as he became to be known. It was because of the Viking the Impaler that the Herman Monument came to be. You see, the town of New Ulm had already, as mentioned, ordered the base for the statue of the Viking back after the death of the freeman Cat. And his death did not sit well with the people of New Ulm at all. They considered themselves a progressive society which had embraced the theory that all men, all created equal, and that all had deserved the same rights, even if their skin color didn't enjoy the right to vote. That would come later. One must learn to walk before running. Anyways, the fact that the Viking had been involved in the death of the freeman Catfish had caused people to change their attitude toward the statue. It was given a wide path while the town council was being lobbied by many of the town folk to just cut their losses and sell the thing, or as many noted, they would not be interested in buying the thing considering its history, which was a good point because the killer having not been caught, might go with the statue when it was sold, which is basically what happened. During the 2 or 3 weeks that it took for the political wheels to turn in New Ulm, several other small animals were found impaled upon the spear. Articles ran about the Viking's left hand once again held an impaled stray cat, the dog named Backdraft, a half-collie, half-yellow lab which belonged to Fred Hofstetter, but that was also the volunteer fire department's honorary member, whose death in such a tragic manner really hit the town's already wounded morale. There were also deaths of several squirrels that were found impaled upon. The mayor had the Viking removed from public access after the town put the statue up for sale. 10 days later, the statue was put on a wagon and hauled off to Minneapolis. Colonel Bob Leader was there to see it on its way. The story goes that he was overheard talking to the statue, telling it that he would be watching, and if there were more killings, that he would see it again, which was considered very strange for obvious reasons. It wasn't until about 2 months later that the colonel received delivery of the statue back from Minneapolis. He had bought it back with his own money. The colonel was again overheard speaking to the statue as it was taken off the wagon used to haul it back and loaded onto his wagon. He told the statue that it might have been able to continue its evil ways if it had just chosen to wait to act again until after the colonel had left this world. However, there was an unusual number of animals killed in that part of Minneapolis after the Viking had arrived. Nobody gave the statue a second thought because the animals had not been impaled upon the spear, although they had died from being impaled by something. People in Minneapolis never gave it any notice, but when the colonel heard of the increase in animal deaths, not to mention what had been discovered in New Ulm after the statue had departed, was enough for him to make the trip to Minneapolis. There he noticed the stained spear and the stained sword. Upon asking about it, the people who had lived near it said they never noticed the stains until he brought it to their attention. What happened to New Ulm after the statue departed, you ask? Well, you remember Mr. Smith, the one who had bent the spear but was back straight the next day? However, the sword was stained red with blood. Well, at the end of the day, hours after the statue had been left from Minneapolis, a report came in to the sheriff that there was a terrible odor coming from the Smith house. Plus, nobody had seen him or any of his family for days, maybe longer. When the sheriff arrived at the Smith house, he didn't even have to go inside to know what he was going to find. What was really the most amazing fact of the entire massacre was the fact that it was not discovered sooner. After all, the Smiths lived right there in the middle of town. All three of the family had died of being stabbed or impaled by something which was not left at the scene of the crime. At the time, the serial killer was not yet well known, or the term serial killer was not yet well known, beyond those who had been aware of Jack the Ripper, who at the time was probably the most notable of his kind. The investigation remained open to this day as murder has no time limitation. What was concluded was that the family was killed sometime shortly after nightfall because they appeared to have been eating their supper when attacked. The wife had been killed from behind. Whatever weapon was used had been thrust through the back of her chair as she sat eating. The child was killed from across the table, and since the child sat closer to the mother, it is theorized that the last to die was Mr. Smith. He actually had made it to his feet and managed to take a couple of steps before meeting his end. It likely all happened and was over in a matter of less than 10 seconds. When the news of the massacre reached the colonel, he was beside himself. He publicly blamed himself for the happenings, but he would not say why. Townfolk near the colonel knew the colonel well enough to know that whatever the reason was that he was blaming himself, that he had no direct connection to the deaths. Clearly, he felt he should have been able to prevent them for some unknown reason. There are rumors which suggest the colonel started negotiations for the return of the Viking that next day, but the proof of such never has been offered. As a side note to that point, there is no evidence of exactly when the colonel began to try and buy back the Viking, so it is entirely possible that he, in fact, did begin negotiation for getting the Viking back when the rumors claim. Now, I suspect you have figured out what gave the statue away. It was not very careful about how it went about its killings. What it definitely was, however, was very direct and did not seem to be a fan of procrastination. The colonel was no fool, however. He recognized how active the killer had been, and he also put together the timeline of the killings of the Smith family and when the statue was in town. They definitely had timelines which crossed. Nobody had recognized the connection, however, except the colonel, who had said nothing to anybody. The only reason it is known today is because of what happened to the colonel on his way back with the statue. It is worth noting, however, that it is likely the colonel would have made known to the public his suspicions in time. The terrible fact of the matter is the colonel didn't live long enough to have that option. On the way back from picking up the statue, an accident happened which left the dear old man impaled upon the spear which belonged to the Viking. However, the colonel lived long enough to write in his own blood across the seat of the wagon these words, and I quote, "Melt down the statue," spelled S-T-A-T-U. He didn't quite get the E written. It ended in a streak, which was obviously where the old man had lost his ability to further control his appendages. However, the message had been written far enough to be clear. The town paid for the statue to be melted down. The metal was then dumped in a deep part of a local lake, which was the plan of the colonel had devised before his death. It was discovered in his notes on his desk. He had already picked out the lake and even the part of the lake where he planned on dumping the melted iron. There was also something else discovered in his notes on his desk. The colonel had noticed a discrepancy in the articles which were written about the impalings that nobody else in the town had noticed. Likely it was because, unlike you, who had the advantage of hearing about the impaling articles almost one after the other, instead of having days apart from one article to the next, they did not spot the problem. Have you yet? At first, the colonel wrote in his notes that the mistakes were probably due to his reporter. After all, it's easy to get the right hand mixed up with the left hand, especially when you are looking at them from across the other party. However, as he read the articles a second and third time, those times around with the advantage of putting them together side by side, he was able to quickly spot that the spear was in the wrong hand in almost half the articles. Here is the part of the story which casts the longest shadow over the story, which is drowning in shadows. The statue was hauled back to town where it sat in front of the sheriff's office awaiting the melting, which was scheduled for the next day. When they came for the statue the next morning, another stray cat was impaled. Only this time the spear was no longer in the statue's hand. This time it was stuck through the cat and then into the door of the sheriff's office, leaving the front door a bloody mess for him when he arrived in the morning. The spear was plucked free of the door, the cat removed, and it, along with the statue, was melted down that day. You can say it was all a coincidence. That was certainly the attitude of the town council, who only acknowledged the statue as a side note to town business during the next scheduled town meeting. In fact, you won't find anything about it in the town history. Even the fact the colonel died in such a manner is not recognized in the history books. Try finding anything about the death of Catfish. And if you do win the prize for greatest researcher, the story was handed down by mouth, and that is the only reason it exists today to be told. That said, the only thing New Ulm was ever guilty of was of being a town which sought to be progressive, which sought to be what we as a society desired to achieve. It is a sad note that they met such dire circumstance as a reward for their effort. Thank you for visiting. Please subscribe as it really helps upstart channels like this one. Godspeed to all.